The recording here. Okay, so again, it's Thursday, June 2nd, 5 p.m., and we're starting on CAEP Standard 5. This is the final webinar in a series on the CAEP standards, and I look forward to your input and feedback when I send you your survey. So here we go. Webinar basics. I think you all, I'm looking at some of the names here, are frequent flyers. So remember to mute your phones, and I see that everybody's done that already. Just remember to unmute when you want to talk. And we don't have a terrible big bunch. Well, we got 15 people online, but I can go ahead and unmute everybody when I come to a question pause. If you want to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat box. And I'll post this recording, or actually the tech team over at CAEP will post this recording as well as the PowerPoint on YouTube, which I find humiliating, but nonetheless on YouTube by June 15th. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint directly, urgently, say you're meeting with faculty, next week or tomorrow, definitely email me. You can see my email address here. It's my business address, lcvinc1@gmail, and feel free to send a request to me there. I'm usually pretty good about responding. What are we hoping to do today is to provide that updated information on addressing the CAEP standards, particularly Standard 5, and its components in the CAEP self-study. And I must say that this is primarily geared for folks that are looking at presenting a self-study that is a selected improvement pathway or a transformation initiative pathway, that the inquiry brief handles its approach to the CAEP Standard 5 in a slightly different manner, and I won't be addressing that exclusively today. If there are questions about it, please raise them during the PowerPoint. Our objectives are you'll be able to understand the key points of Standard 5 and its components, and of course that applies to everyone. List the kinds of evidence that CAEP recommends for each of the components, and again, this could apply to everyone. Describe how the standard and its components will be evaluated by CAEP reviewers, and know when areas for improvement or stipulations may be assigned, and we'll be cycling back when I get through component 5.1 to talk about what the difference is between an AFI and a stipulation. Okay, I always start these by focusing on the language of the standard itself. And the reason that I do that is because there is a difference in the selected improvement and transformation initiative pathways in how the standards are addressed, in the sense that you provide a holistic summary statement related to your evidence. And that summary statement should not be written component to component. It should be written addressing the standard language itself, not the component language. So what the standard is attempting to show, and what you want to be able to show through the evidence that you upload related to each of the components, is that you maintain a quality assurance system, that you've got valid data from multiple measures, that you support continuous improvement, and then it's sustained, and then it's evidence-based. It's not something that you do every time the accreditor cycles through, every 7 to 10 years, 7 years under the CAEP regulations. Okay, it's sustained, and it's evidence-based. That it's not just, oh, well, we kind of need to tweak this course, but that you've got evidence that you're relying upon to provide direction to you about what does need improvement. And that you're using the results of inquiry and or data collection to establish your priorities, enhance program elements and capacity, and test innovations, all of which we hope is geared towards improving completers' impact on student learning and development. Ultimately, that's our goal, to have an excellent set of teacher candidates leaving our programs and serving in our nation's schools as effective teachers. So, given that that's the standard in the standard language, the components here are parts of the standard to which you should pay some attention. Each one of these standards for SI and TI approaches need to have something, some kind of evidence uploaded to demonstrate under 5.1 that you have a quality assurance system, to demonstrate under 5.2 that your quality assessment measures are good quality, and to demonstrate under 5.5 that there is stakeholder or partner involvement in your quality assurance system. Now, the reason why I'm pointing to those three components particularly, and why they're not in red, is because you must address these components. You must have some evidence to demonstrate under each of these components. But you don't have to meet the component. However, those components that appear here in red, 5.3 and 5.4, must be met in order to meet the standard. So it is likely that if you do not have strong evidence under continuous improvement to demonstrate that your continuous improvement is systematic and purposeful, you run the risk of failing Standard 5 as a result. So we'll talk about that more, but I wanted to give you that overview. In terms of general rules for Standard 5, and these are general evidence rules, is that phase-in requirements must be met. So if you're an EPP who is submitting their self-study before September 1st, who is submitting their self-study before 2016 concludes, then you are allowed to submit plans and progress on those plans. And that's part of the phase-in requirement. However, if you're submitting your self-study and your visit occurs in 2018 calendar year, then you cannot submit plans for the various components and standards. You must, in fact, have the evidence fully in place. I just distinguished between components being addressed and components being met. You must address all components. You must have some evidence to bring to bear in each component. But components 5.3 and 5.4 must be met for the standard to be met. If you're submitting data for Standard 5, it must be sequential. You can't sort of drop out a semester if things don't look so good. And it must be the latest available. So for example, if your self-study report is going in the fall of 2017, then the latest available data that you would have on hand to include in your self-study would be from spring of 2017. I hope that makes sense to you. And your EPP-created assessments need to be rated at the CAEP sufficient level or better. If you haven't submitted your assessments for early instrument evaluation, they are submitted and evaluated by the reviewers using the CAEP rubric for assessing assessment instruments. And here is that rubric. If you haven't seen this, it is part of the accreditation handbook, Appendix G, which appears on page, well, it says here page 1, but it's actually far further into the back of the accreditation handbook. And you can also find it under accreditation resources, where it appears on its own as the CAEP assessment rubric. So your assessments need to be rated by the reviewers at CAEP's level of sufficiency, which is right here in the middle. This is where you want to be in terms of what's the purpose, how are candidates informed, what's the content of the assessment and the scoring of it, and how are validity and reliability established. So take a peek at those assessment rubrics if you haven't done so yet. Now let's get back to the PowerPoint. So that's what we mean when we say these are general rules for Standard 5, and this appears as a general rule for all the standards. Your EPP-created assessments must be rated as sufficient or better. Okay, so let's dig into Component 1, and after Component 1 we'll have a brief question pause. Component 1 says that you have a quality assurance system and that it's comprised of multiple measures and that it can do three things for you. It can monitor candidate progress, it can document completer achievements, and this is probably your standard 4 sets of, data sets there, and that it can monitor provider operational effectiveness. And this is often something that gets left to the wayside for many people. As we monitor candidate performance and progress, we tend to focus on our candidates. And yet, operational effectiveness of the EPP as a whole is also an important aspect of quality assurance and a quality assurance system. So what you need to ask yourself is, what evidence do you have that would demonstrate that you have in your EPP a comprehensive quality assurance system that incorporates all three of these facets of that system? So what's some of the evidence that CAEP might be looking for to satisfy that you have addressed this component? Well, you could submit a description of how evidence is submitted in Standards 1 through 4, of how the evidence that was submitted in Standards 1 through 4 was collected, analyzed, monitored, and reported. So some people do that with a graphic, some people do that with a graphic and a narrative that explains, the various transition points and the various key assessments across all programs that are collected and analyzed, monitored, and reported, and then used as evidence for the candidate standards 1 through 4. You can also submit evidence of your system capabilities. Okay, and what does that mean? Well, what it means is that there is support for data-driven change, that if you have an assessment system in place, and let's say you're monitoring student impact on student learning while your candidates are still in your programs, can you get that data out? Okay, and then do you look at it, and does it indicate to you that changes are in order? That there is application of the system across and within licensure areas, that there are no programs that are sort of off to the wayside doing their own thing on Excel spreadsheets if you have a software platform, etc., that your system capabilities are comprehensive and all-inclusive, and that you can disaggregate data for management and policy-making decisions. So for example here, a disaggregation of data could be at the program level, licensure level, I should say, because that is an expectation in Standard 1 for CAEP, that you can disaggregate your data by program, licensure area. But you might also want to disaggregate data for other purposes, okay, whether that's by cohort or semester, or by demographics of your candidates, or by those who have attained, let's say, are below expectations in terms of rubrics that you employ to evaluate their performance. So think about how disaggregating data is apparent in your quality assurance system. And then last of all, CAEP is suggesting that there should be included a description of the schedule and process for continuous review of your quality assurance system with the roles and responsibilities of system users. And I have not, as a general rule, seen that our assessment systems, our quality assurance systems, are monitored for their effectiveness very often. And so this is something for you to think about as you're approaching Standard 5. Remember, this component 5.1 does not need to be met, which means that you don't need to provide evidence of all the possible language that's in component 5.1, but you must address 5.1. So, as CAEP has pointed out, there may be components that are stronger than others. There may be components that are of greater priority to an EPP, and that's perfectly acceptable to CAEP. But you must provide evidence at least that you have a quality assurance system in place. So let's look at what are the reviewers going to be looking for. Well, they're going to be looking for evidence that you've got multiple measures in there and that you can evaluate your operational effectiveness. As I said earlier, operational effectiveness in a grand sense is often overlooked in favor of candidate performance, and so that's why I've underlined it here, is simply to bring that to the forefront of your thinking. They're also going to look for evidence of regular review of system operations and data. They're going to look that your system has these capacities, that you can collect, analyze, monitor, and report evidence, that you can disaggregate data, as you can see, other dimensions, demographics, over time, etc., and that you can monitor your operational effectiveness by setting priorities, tracking data, etc. And as it says here, they want to find evidence of access and use by a variety of users for multiple purposes. So this isn't something that just your assessment coordinator, for example, would have access to and would be using on a regular basis. So when might an area for improvement or a stipulation be assigned? An area for improvement you can think of as, well, this is kind of a weakness that we found in the evidence that you presented, and this might be something for you to work on. And in fact, addressing areas for improvement is something that appears in the annual report, where CAEP looks to see what progress has been made in addressing any areas that were identified as needing improvement. So the areas for improvement there are observable deficiencies in the quality assurance system. And the observable deficiencies might include that there's no regular review of data, that there's no systematic collection of it, there's no analysis of reporting of data and evidence. So something to consider. If data quality is deficient in significant ways, it's incoherent, it's disjointed, it's below sufficient at the CAEP level, CAEP sufficient level in the rubric, or if there's absolutely no analysis of specialty licensure area data, or no evidence of that. So areas for improvement will be something that the reviewers might point out. You've addressed component 5.1, but they might point out that, you really need to be establishing some systematic approach to reviewing the system itself, okay? A stipulation is an area for improvement that is so serious that CAEP will expect you to address it and remove the stipulation within 2 years. And a stipulation could be assigned under component 5.1 if there's no evidence of a functioning quality assurance system. So they see that there's some data collection here and there's an assessment director who's gathering what they can get when they can get it, but as far as a fully functioning quality assurance system is not evident. All right, feedback and question pause. I'm going to unmute everybody to see if there's anything to be said here. There we go. You're all unmuted, at least on my end. So if you want to speak up, let me know. Or, alternatively, you can pose a question in the chat box. All right. Well, hearing no questions emerging, got to speak up quickly here, folks, huh? Don't give you much wait time. All right, let's go to the next one. We're talking about component 5.2 here. Again, this is a component that you must address, but it is not a component that you must meet in order to meet the standard. So this is the one that's about the quality of your assessment tools. And what they're looking for here is that you're relying on relevant, verifiable, representative, cumulative, actionable measures that produce empirical evidence that your data are valid and consistent. I'm going to dig into what CAEP means by each of these terms. What do they mean by relevant, verifiable, representative, etc. on the very next slide, if I would push next instead of previous. There we go. Okay, so what does relevant mean? It means that there's evidence that the measures provide evidence of what they claim to be assessing. Okay, so they're relevant. They to what the candidates are being assessed on. For example, if they're in student teaching, then surely what's going to be relevant is how well they can actually implement, apply what they've learned in your programs. Verifiable is that your data records are accurate enough that the data and analyses on that data can be replicated by a third party with similar results. And this is something that you can expect that your reviewers might ask to do, because they are asked by CAEP, no matter what pathway, to conduct some independent audits of the data that you presented. And so this may be something that you want to make sure that your data records are accurate and available to the reviewers. Representative, you want to make sure that your data samples are free of bias and should be typical of completed assessments, and that you can delineate what the sample does or does not represent. And what CAEP's meaning here is that in lots of previous reports that I've read, we see particular programs well represented in the narrative or in the data sets because they've got good data, and so they appear routinely. And yet what's happening here is that it's sort of masking other programs that don't have good data, or actually ignoring other programs that do not have good data. And CAEP's looking for representativeness. So when you produce a data set that shows an EPP average, that it's representative of your programs and your candidates. That the data is cumulative means that there's at least 3 administrations of the assessment. If you haven't heard prior to this, 3 cycles or 3 administrations of the assessment depend on the assessment itself. If it's a student teaching evaluation and you have student teachers out in the field in fall and spring, then 3 cycles means fall, spring, fall. If you have your state licensure exams that come out once a year, then 3 cycles means 2012, 2013, 2013, 2014, 2014, 2015. 3 years of data. And last, they're asking that data be actionable. Okay, so that you've got information on candidates' achievements and performance that gives you the kind of data that you can actually use to inform changes and guide faculty. Okay, both on the downside in terms of making improvements and on the upside in terms of, boy, things are going really well here. How do we know what's going well, and how can we bring this to scale? All right, I see a question coming up in the chat that I may have. Oh, okay, yeah, it's a request for the PowerPoint. I'm going to send you back my email address. Okay. So there we go. Those are what those terms mean. So what's CAEP expecting in terms of evidence that you can submit for this? Well, a description of developmental steps in constructing the instruments, like how did you create your student teaching observation form? 9 times out of 10, okay, this kind of explanation is going to be included when you upload the data from an EPP assessment and link it to your standard 1. So throughout the handbook, you'll see references to linking to component 5.2. And this description of developmental steps in constructing the instruments is a part of the questions and the narrative that's provided when you upload an EPP created assessment into the system. Another thing that they'll expect is analytical data that supports the use of the instrument for its purposes, a formal study of the alignment of instruments with their goals, implementation procedures and context, empirical evidence that interpretations are consistent and valid. Again, most of this will have already been included in the responses to your questions related to any EPP created assessments. Now, I've highlighted this as if applicable. Some of you did submit early instrument evaluation assessments for that process. I know the results have been slow in coming. However, if you have your results, then you can include for component 5.2 those results and what actions you've taken as a result. If you do not have the results of your early instrument evaluation yet, I can personally guarantee that you will have those results by the end of September. Why? Because we're in the process of training the assessment reviewers, and we're going to get rid of that backlog by the end of September. So what are CAEP reviewers looking for as they look at your evidence in component 5.2? Well, again, general rules are met. But they're also looking that at least half of your EPP created assessments are going to be scored at the sufficient level or above. They're also looking that your documentation about EPP created assessments, and as I said, whenever you upload that, into the self-study evidence, there will be questions that pop up that you must respond to. And they're going to expect documentation in those responses that you've established content validity, that your inter-rater reliability is at 80% or better, and that survey questions align to standards at a minimum. They're going to look that your evidence is relevant, verifiable, and we've been through each one of these terms. And they're going to look for documentation that interpretations of evidence are consistent. Now, those interpretations and pieces can also be a part of what you have uploaded in the various standards under those components of various other standards, and so you can reference that in component 5.2. When might an AFI or a stipulation be assigned? Well, there isn't any evidence that maybe there might be a stipulation assigned in 5.2, but multiple AFIs can raise something to the level of a stipulation if your assessments, the majority of your assessments, are below the sufficient level. If, for example, content validity or inter-rater reliability is not well described or it doesn't exist. If there's no documentation that the relevance, verifiability, representativeness, cumulative, and actionability of that evidence in those assessments is present, or no evidence that data, oops, I forgot an S. You wouldn't know how many times I've looked at this PowerPoint. No or limited evidence that data or evidence was interpreted or analyzed. So one of my cues that I often give to people who are writing their self-studies is take time to analyze and interpret the evidence that you upload under components, and then when you come to writing the holistic statement, you talk across evidence buckets to say, as a whole, what do all of these together, what do all of these assessments of evidence pieces tell us about meeting the standard? So that's a different level of interpretation. It's not an individual evidence piece interpretation and analysis. It's a holistic interpretation and analysis. And we'll visit that at the very end as I bring up some things to think about as you're writing that holistic statement. Any feedback or questions? I'm going to unmute everybody again to see if you've got anything on your mind about component 5.2. And right now, what is an EIE? That's the Early Instrument Evaluation. That's where people submitted their assessments up to 3 years in advance of their self-study to CAEP for feedback on their EPP-created assessments. So I've abbreviated it instead of writing out Early Instrument Evaluation every time. That's what EIE is. Another question is regarding having the most recent cycles. We're due to submit in a few days, and I have not had time to analyze and include the spring assessment data. Yes, that's perfect. That's perfect, Elaine. What basically you're saying in your thing is, look, up until fall of 2015 was the most recent available. Anything from spring 16 will be available on site. You can certainly that certainly will not come as a surprise to CAEP reviewers because it's due imminently and your spring semester has just finished within the last couple of weeks. So that's perfectly acceptable. All right, let's see. Any other questions? I don't see any in my chat box. All right, then we're going to forge on. Component 5.3, one of the ones you must address. And that's why it's in red here. Okay, I consider this the continuous improvement component, that you regularly and systematically are assessing your performance against your goals, you're tracking your results, you're testing innovations, you're looking at the effects of selection criteria on candidate progress and completion, and you're using the results to improve your programs and your processes. So, think, and this is how I summarize this, what evidence do I have that would demonstrate systematic continuous improvement? And I noticed in many of the documents that I've been reading through that come from EPPs that there's really a lot of use of data going on, but a lot of the data use tends to be confined at the course level or the program level. So just something to think about for yourselves. What EPP-wide kinds of changes would the data indicate? And I also think that sometimes we can get a little tweak crazy in education. After we teach a course, we just want to fidget with that rubric or whatever. I would think that this component is really asking us to be a little more judicious, and this is my own personal opinion, in using data to guide our decisions. That after one semester we may learn some things, but maybe we need to let it sit for a bit before we have a knee-jerk reaction to what needs to be changed or what needs to be done, and to rely more on data to guide our decisions. So what component 5.3 is suggesting as possible evidence is, of course, when do you regularly and systematically make modifications that are either drawn from the research. We read as scholars about innovations in education and studies that are coming out, and perhaps we learn something that we say, oh, wow, we need to be doing that in our programs. Perfectly acceptable, as well as analysis from your own quality assurance system, as well as from standards, whether those are CAEP standards or other standards that lead you to say, wow, this is something we need to change. For example, I'll use CAEP component 1.4, which is all about college and career-ready standards. Now, whether your state's adopted those or not, what that component is looking for is evidence that your candidates can demonstrate how they can teach to college and career-ready standards such that all students have access and opportunity to learn. And what we found is that many times EPPs have their students include, the aims in their lesson planning that are derived from state standards. However, it's not often that EPPs are actually assessing the degree, the quality of how candidates are actually teaching to that particular aim or state standard. And so that is an example of how a change in your programs might be implemented just based on the CAEP standards that's requiring you now to show how candidates can demonstrate their teaching effectiveness. But also that these changes are tied to your goals and relevant standards. So you don't need to be making changes that are just kind of all out there if they're not relevant to what you're trying to achieve. And if one of your goals is to have effective teachers who can have an impact on student learning, positive impact, then teaching to college and career-ready standards or whatever state standards is particularly relevant, and that would be a goal. Also, CAEP is looking for examples here of well-planned tests. And the tests that they're looking for are of two kinds. One is selection criteria. And as you know, component 3.2, admission selectivity, and component 3.3 on other selectivity criteria are part of CAEP Standard 3, and 3.2 admission selectivity must be met. Well, what CAEP is looking for here is to what degree have you delved into your selection criteria and followed those criteria through to candidate completion to determine whether or not those selection criteria are effective in getting you the best candidates possible who graduate from your programs ready and able to teach as beginning teachers, effective beginning teachers. So in initiating these well-planned tests, whether it's of selection criteria or it's of another data-driven change, they're looking for baseline, they're looking for intervention, they're looking for tracking over time, rationales, results, next steps taken or planned. I think that if you're doing a selected improvement pathway, that your selected improvement plan itself would be evidence of a well-planned test of a data-driven change to determine whether or not those changes are an improvement, because those selected improvement plans include these exact same items. So you can also use the results, again, of that early instrument evaluation. You can use the results of your improvement plan, or you can use the results of any other plans that may have been submitted. Because now, if you're submitting a self-study, you have to submit your plan as well as progress towards that plan. All of that can be tagged to your component 5.3. Reviewers, you can read this yourselves, but our general rules, are they met? And we addressed those earlier. Again, look at this. There's that piece about reviewing your quality assurance system data. I recently had the experience, and it was a positive one in the end, of being with an EPP who claimed that they had all kinds of impact on student learning data in their software platform, and that it was for all programs and all candidates, etc. But when we asked for, well, okay, let me see your, impact on student learning data for, fall 2015 as compared to spring 2015, they couldn't get it out of the system. So reviewing your quality assurance system data is something really important to do, is to probe it occasionally and make sure that what you're putting in there you can get out, and get it out in a way that's meaningful to you. Again, if you can identify patterns across preparation programs in terms of strengths as well as weaknesses, if you use data for continuous improvement, if you're testing any innovations that you put in place. They're hoping to find that 80% or more of the changes or modifications that you cite under Component 5.3 are linked back to evidence and data, and that you can provide specific examples of how those changes or modifications were derived, implemented, and then monitored and evaluated. They're looking for description of explicit investigation of selection criteria. This we just went through. Standard 3, Component 3.2. In terms of, here's our selection criteria, how does that tell us? What does that tell us about candidate progress and program completion? What criteria appear to be the strongest, the most influential, or predictive of candidate successful progress and completion? And what they're hoping here is that any data-driven changes are ongoing and based on systematic assessment and result in positive improvements. So reviewers are going to be looking for all of these things when they look at your evidence for 5.3. Remember, it's in red because 5.3 must be met. And so if you're now putting together your evidence for 5.3, I'd look to make sure that you've got something to show for each one of these things in terms of what reviewers are looking for. This is based on that CAEP rubric for Component 5.3 that appears in the accreditation handbook. That is the rubric that will be used by reviewers to look at your evidence in Component 5.3. So when might AFIs or stipulations be assigned? Well, again, AFIs are weaknesses. So if there's documentation that you're regularly and systematically reviewing your quality assurance system kind of minimally, and what CAEP is saying is that there's only 2 or fewer of the following. That you're reviewing your QA system and maybe you're using data for continuous improvement, but they can't find evidence of your posing questions about what the data is telling you, if you're identifying patterns, if you're investigating differences, or you're testing innovation. So think about the ways in which you can strengthen your regular and systematic review of your quality assurance system, leading to continuous improvement by doing some of these things, posing questions, identifying patterns, investigating what the differences are. If your elementary education program, and I'm talking from experience here, is scoring lower on the state licensure exams, what's up with that? Why is that? Who are the students that are not passing the state licensure exams? Do they have anything in common? And is there any way that we as an EPP can support them in passing their state licensure exam? Because it's critical. They've gone through the programs. They need to have a license at the end of that. So there you go. If you can't link your changes back to evidence or data, And that's sort of that ANIC data that leads to changes. Oh, I wasn't really happy with that rubric, so I changed it. What they really want to see is that those changes are linked back to a data set. That there's evidence from standards 1 through 4 that you don't cite that or apply any evidence from standards 1 through 4. As I said, throughout those standards, there are opportunities for you to link that to 5.2. And as you analyze and interpret your data for each of the components through standards 1 through 4, you can also link that to 5.3 to show how you have analyzed and interpreted your data that have led to a particular change or modification. And if there's no investigation of selection criteria. So if this is not something that you have initiated as yet, an investigation of your admission selectivity, it might be something to consider, because it appears that there might be an area for improvement assigned. And assigning an area for improvement does not mean that you have failed the component. It's possible to pass the component but still have something you need to work on. So don't panic, but keep that in mind. If you're way out, far out in terms of your next visit, let's say you're out at 2020 or 2021 or further, then initiating an investigation of selection criteria would be in your best interests. Stipulation, and that's the you got to fix this in 2 years kind of weakness, means that there's no compelling evidence that data are used as a basis for continuous improvement. So if you've got a lot of yada yada out there, but no data that's showing how you've systematically referred to your data and evidence and presented that to stakeholders and it's resulted in a recommendation for significant changes, then you might be in trouble in this component. Okay, I'm going to feedback and question pause it again. I don't know if you're muted or unmuted, but I'm going to unmute you all again. I see another request for the PowerPoint, and I will do that to the best of my ability. All right, I don't see any new questions coming up in the chat either. So that either means you're all shell-shocked, or you're all asleep, or you just don't have any questions right now. Okay, going back to muting you and going on to component 5.4, which is the other component that must be met to pass standard 5. So this is a very interesting component to me, because what it's asking is that your measures of completer impact, and that really means standard 4, okay, including available outcome data on P12 student growth, are summarized, benchmarked, analyzed, shared widely, and acted upon in decision making. So what evidence do you have that would demonstrate that you examine and use data on completer performance? So some of this may already be presented in your response and evidence collection for standard 4, in which case you want to link it to component 5.4. But in addition to doing that, there's some other things that you can do to provide evidence for meeting component 5.4. And that is the standard 4, evidence of using the data from program impact measures. So not just that you're collecting it, but that you're using it. So I know that many of us have employer satisfaction surveys and completer satisfaction surveys that we may have implemented long ago. Okay, have you been using the data from those instruments? Have you used employer satisfaction to inform completer satisfaction? And what kinds of questions have you derived from that, and how have you addressed them? Evidence of the use of outcome measures. Now these are the measures that appear in the annual report. Program impact and program outcome together comprise the 8 annual measures that appear in the annual report. Now granted, I know they weren't in the annual report this year, but there's a reason for that, and CAEP is revising the questions that they're asking about those 8 annual measures, so that next year, when that report becomes available, you will find them included in the annual report again. So when you're looking at the outcome measures, you're looking at your completer or graduation rates, the licensure rates, the employment rates, and then again the consumer information. And what CAEP is looking for here is not that you have those rates available, but that you're actually using them to inform your programs. So for example, they're looking for analysis of what are the trends. Are there any trends that are appearing here? Can you compare these with other benchmarks within programs, across programs, with the EPP as a whole? Can you find any indication of changes that have been made in curriculum and experience as a result, or changes in resources, or future directions that you've identified? So this is where CAEP is saying not just report this, but also to talk about how they inform each other and what are the trends and impact that you can determine from them. So what they're looking for, you'll see right here everything I've just been telling you. They're looking for an analysis of trends. They're looking for comparison with benchmarks. They're looking for evidence of corresponding resource allocations if appropriate, or future directions. So don't think that you have to show that you've completely redone your budget as a result. But if there has been an impact on the resources that you allocate to a specific program or to the EPP as a whole, perhaps you invest more in technology because your completers are saying in their satisfaction survey that they don't feel confident in using technology. If your employer satisfaction surveys are telling you that they don't think your candidates are particularly adept at using technology to provide access to instruction for all students, that's something where a resource allocation might be implied to provide upgraded, updated, or more technology to have available to candidates, so that when they become completers and they're in service, they can make use of what you've taught them. So they also want to see that the evidence of the 8 measures and the trends are posted on your website, or that you're widely sharing them. So it happens to be a requirement of one of the higher education accreditors that this outcome and impact measures are posted on the website. And so I think there was a big press from CAEP at one time to ask, okay, where can we find this on your website? And the point here is that there's a lot of competition out there, and so what you want to be doing is sharing the data on your candidates that shows how your candidates perform and how they're hiring, and do they go for licensure and complete it, and are they graduating, and are they being hired? And these are important questions and should be shared widely, if not on your website. And then, again, the reviewers are looking for program changes that link back to your EPP's evidence for topics described in the 8 annual measures. So any changes or modifications, I was puzzled for a time about what that meant by topics described in the 8 annual measures. Well, what they're looking for are program changes or modifications to, let's say, improve graduation rates, or improve licensure percentages, or to improve teacher effectiveness of completers, or to improve the satisfaction of your completers. So those are changes or modifications at the EPP level or program level that can be linked back to the topics that are related to the 8 annual measures. When might AFIs or stipulations be assigned? I'm going to start from the bottom here and say that they can't find that these 8 measures are posted on your website, and you don't provide any evidence that you share the data from those 8 measures widely. If they can't find that the data are summarized, okay, or they find that they're summarized but there's nothing more complete than that. If you just say, well, here's a summary of how our completers are doing on these 4 areas, they're really looking for, as I have underscored a number of times at this point, an analysis of any trends. You can determine comparisons with benchmarks, changes for the future, etc. So think about how you can use those 8 annual measures. You've got 2 years worth, if you're continuing accreditation, already uploaded as part of your annual report. This year that was absent, but that doesn't mean because it was absent in the annual report that you necessarily stopped collecting that information if you had it. And so what you want to do is represent it and analyze it across all the measures. All right, I'm going to pause one more time, and we're down into the final stretch here with the last component. We've got 10 minutes left, and I believe we can hit it all. The idea of 8 annual measures, this is coming up in the chat, is new to me. What does that mean, and where can I find more information in the CAEP guide? Oh boy. The 8 annual measures is just a term for 8 categories of information that are requested usually as part of the annual report. That's why they're called the 8 annual measures. And those are all of Standard 4, the 4 components of Standard 4, as well as the 4 buckets that we named earlier that have to do with outcome measures. So let me go back to a slide where we actually laid those out. Okay, graduation rates, licensure rates, employment rates, consumer information. Those are the other 4 measures that comprise the 8 annual measures. You can find information about this in the CAEP handbook. If you go to the table of contents right up front, there'll be something that talks about the 8 annual measures. There's a section. There's also a big section included in the appendices. Okay, and let me get out my accreditation handbook. No, wait, I've got it up here for you because I thought a question might come up. Here we go. We're in the accreditation handbook. You know, I'm old school. I often prefer paper, and so I always think, oh, let me get that out. All right. So here you go, Part 3, CAEP. Part 3, the accreditation process, right here. Annual reporting starts on page 88. You'll find a brief description there. Then if you go down here a little further, you'll see Appendix F. It says 8 annual reporting measures. Starts on page 164, and it'll give you quite a bit of information right there. Okay? Great. Okay, somebody has said, our EPP has very limited access to value-added data, which are sparse and inconsistent. Should we attempt to analyze these limited data sets? To the extent that that's possible, Kenneth, what people are doing when they have limited or spotty, inconsistent value-added data, and I was talking to an EPP recently who said, boy, it came out one year and then it hasn't come out since, and blah, blah, blah. You know, that's the kind of stuff that I would sort of put out there just because I'm kind of type A about it, is that I'd put that out there and say, you know, here's what we got once. But here's what it didn't show us, and here's why it wasn't particularly useful. Here's what we could learn from it, but without having subsequent years by which to compare it, we find it of limited utility, okay? What CAEP would expect then is that you're supplementing it somehow, and either you're doing, and this goes into Standard 4 rather than Standard 5 here, but what you're doing is you're implementing case studies, or you've got other ways in which you're trying to get at the impact of your candidates in terms of P12 learning. So there's a variety of things that people are doing to try to get that information. And if you go into the Standard 4 in the accreditation handbook, and let me go up. Oh, here, somebody asked about early instrument evaluation. Now they're calling it early assessment evaluation. Here's a whole section in the accreditation handbook that talks about that. So I digress. Let me go back here to point out where you can find information on Standard 4. Okay, let me scroll up here. Okay, right here under Standard 4, appearing on page 48 and going up to page 58, you'll find a whole bunch, including in the evaluation rubric and the evidence table, some suggestions about what to do when you have limited access to value added. Okay. Final component that does not need to be met but does need to be addressed is that, wait a minute, why am I back here? 154. Oh, I know, I went back to find something for somebody. Here we go. 5.5, this is all about your stakeholders and whether they've been involved in your quality assurance system. We know that stakeholders are involved in our partnerships and perhaps are engaged with placements, et cetera, but this is that you might have an advisory board or other ways in which you bring stakeholders together to look at the evaluation of your programs, how you might improve, identifying things that are going well. Okay? So the basic question is, what evidence do you have that your stakeholders are involved with the quality assurance system? And the suggested evidence is pretty straightforward. A description of stakeholders and their roles, specific examples of shared decision-making and the results. And one thing I want to point out here is don't submit the entire set of minutes you have from your advisory council. What you want to do is excerpt and submit some selected samples where the topic was directly related to data and directly related to making a decision about it. Okay, that's what you want to share. That's what you want to highlight. You don't want to have to make your reviewers go through 50 pages of minutes to find what you want them to see. And you want to show that stakeholders have been involved in evaluation, selection, and implementing improvements, and so that they've been able to weigh in on your plans, to make suggestions in terms of how to evaluate improvements, make suggestions about improvements that they feel would be important to help your programs. Reviewers are going to be looking for exactly what we've just said, specific evidence that your stakeholders are involved in these three areas, and that you identify at least 2 examples of the use of and input from stakeholders. So at a minimum, if you're going to address this standard, you need to provide 2 examples of the use of and input from stakeholders. All right, AFIs or stipulations, if there's no list of particular stakeholders, nobody knows who your stakeholders are. And often I read things where there's a lot of talk about the faculty, but I don't often hear talk about school partners or businesses or local entities that are engaged. If you don't have examples of stakeholder input, or we can't really find out how stakeholders are involved in your processes. I'm going to scoot right past this slide and get back to the big picture. This was the language from the standard itself. And so when you're looking to write that holistic summary, and again, this is for Selected Improvement and Transformation Initiative, you upload all your evidence, tagging it to the components in a standard, and then you write a holistic summary statement about what that evidence has shown. So you're using information from several sources. You've uploaded evidence into all 5 of the component buckets in this standard. So you're going to be looking across all of those evidence buckets. They already are from several sources, okay? That you're analyzing that data across evidence sources, across program areas, demographics, time. You're not going component by component and talking through each one of your evidence buckets that way. That you're identifying trends or patterns, that you're posing questions and perhaps identifying plans for how you're going to further explore what you found from your data, that you're making appropriate interpretations and conclusions, and that you have planned or completed actions for change. So this is part of what the holistic summary would include. And I've got a final feedback, a question pause here. I thought I had another slide for you, but I don't. Okay. So making the case for Standard 5, just think, don't go component by component. Although, I will say for the components that must be met, I think that I would spend some additional time talking about how data is used for changes and how you've analyzed those 8 annual measures to demonstrate that you're meeting Standard 5 by meeting these components. All right. Any final questions from everybody? We are at 5:59 right now. Hip, hip, hooray. I've got a question from Sue asking me what other webinars will I be hosting this summer. Right now, Sue, I'm not going to be hosting any other webinars for this summer. I'm involved in doing training the assessment reviewers to get rid of that backlog of early instrument evaluations. And so there are 2 webinars a month for assessment reviewers. And perhaps in the spring, because the CAEP guidelines for advanced programs will be out, I'll be hosting webinars on those advanced program guidelines. I did host webinars on cross-cutting themes in the past, and those are archived and available. Not on the CAEP website, and this is a question from Elizabeth. These now appear on YouTube, which is a CAEP sort of venue. I guess they were taking up a lot of space on the website, so they put them up on YouTube. Of course, I find that humiliating, because of course I don't like to listen to what I say after the fact, because I think I sound so silly. But CAEP has got them up there, and you're welcome to access them. They also appear with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation in PDF form. Someone's saying here that the appendices are very specific, and is there any area where we can include all charts and tables and then refer to them in the narrative of our report? Include all charts and tables. You mean in the appendices related to the selected improvement pathway or the IB tables and charts, etc.? Those should be available to you as a part of your template. If there's a specific chart or table that you would like to include and that it's not a part of your template, then let us know. You can write to CAEP staff, or you can certainly write to me and say, hey Deb, there's this table that appears on page blah blah of the accreditation handbook, and I'd like a copy of that table in Word. Can we use it? Definitely. There are some new tables being developed for Standard 2, for example, that show depth, breadth, and coherence of clinical experiences. Those were a part of Stevie's presentation on Standard 2 at the Spring CAEP Conference, and those tables are available to use now if you would like to. So shoot me an email, and I can definitely share those with you. I don't see any other questions, so I'm unmuting you all. We're now at 6:02, and if I don't hear any other questions or see any other questions come up in the chat room, then I am going to call it a day and stop recording. I thank you all for being present. I thank you for being helpful to me. I will be sending you a survey to complete at some point, and I look forward to your feedback. Bye-bye, everybody.